June 6th, 1944. 0710 hours. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell crouched at the base of a 100-foot cliff at Pointe du Hoc, watching German soldiers appear at the cliff top above him. He had not slept in 26 hours. His hands were raw and bleeding from the rope climb. His Thompson submachine gun felt impossibly heavy, and every muscle in his body screamed from the brutal ascent. The cliff face was near vertical, scarred by Allied naval bombardment that had turned solid rock into a treacherous maze of loose stone and crater holes. Above him, somewhere in the smoke and chaos, were German defenders who had been waiting for this moment. They knew the Rangers were coming. They had prepared for weeks, and now, as Lomell and his men hung exposed on the cliff face, those defenders were dropping grenades down on them. The grenades tumbled down the cliff, bouncing off rocks, exploding in airbursts that sent shrapnel in every direction. Men screamed. Some lost their grip and fell, hitting the beach, below, or landing in the water where their equipment dragged them under. Others were hit by shrapnel but kept climbing because there was nowhere else to go. You couldn't climb down faster than a grenade could fall. Behind Lomell, scattered along the narrow beach, were the survivors of the initial landing. 225 Rangers had left the transport ships. German machine gun fire had torn through the landing craft before they reached shore. Some boats were sunk, others were driven off course. Rangers had been forced to swim through freezing water under fire, losing equipment, losing men, losing precious time. The mission was already behind schedule. The naval bombardment was supposed to have neutralized the German defenses. It hadn't. The bombing runs were supposed to have destroyed the gun emplacements. They hadn't. The follow-up Ranger battalions were supposed to land 30 minutes after the first assault, if the cliff top was secured. They wouldn't be coming. The signal hadn't been sent because the cliff top wasn't secure. Lomell looked up. Through the smoke, he could see the silhouette of a German soldier leaning over the edge, looking down, searching for targets. The German had a rifle. He was scanning the cliff face methodically, looking for Rangers to shoot. Lomell raised his Thompson one-handed while holding the rope with his other hand and fired a burst. The German disappeared, but there would be more. There were always more. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This was Pointe du Hoc, the most fortified position on the Normandy coast. This was the gun battery that could destroy the entire western flank of the Allied invasion. And these were the Rangers who had been given an impossible mission: climb this cliff under fire, destroy the guns, and hold the position until relieved. The numbers said they couldn't do it. The terrain said they couldn't do it. The German defenders, confident in their prepared positions, believed the Americans would be slaughtered before they reached the top. But the Germans didn't understand what Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder had built into these men during 6 months of brutal training. They didn't understand the tactical innovations that had been developed specifically for this assault, and they couldn't have known that the Rangers would discover something at the top of that cliff that would change everything about the mission. What happened over the next 48 hours would become one of the most remarkable defensive stands in American military history. Against overwhelming odds, with casualties mounting by the hour and no reinforcements coming, the Rangers would hold Pointe du Hoc long enough for the Normandy beachhead to be secured. But the cost would be staggering, and the story of how they did it reveals truths about combat, leadership, and human endurance that transcend tactics or firepower. Pointe du Hoc was a natural fortress. The promontory jutted into the English Channel like a stone fist, rising 100 feet above the water. From its cliff top, observers could see both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. The strategic value was obvious to anyone who understood military geography. More importantly, intelligence reports indicated that 6 155mm guns were positioned there in reinforced concrete casemates. Each gun could hurl a 95-pound shell more than 12 miles with devastating accuracy. Those guns could reach both landing beaches. They could fire on the invasion fleet. They could turn the entire western sector of the invasion into a killing zone. Allied planners had identified Pointe du Hoc as one of the most dangerous threats to Operation Overlord. If those guns remained operational on D-Day, they could slaughter troops landing on the beaches below. Destroyers and battleships offshore would be vulnerable to plunging fire from the clifftop. The entire invasion could be compromised by a single battery of German artillery positioned on ground that nature had designed for defense. The German defenders understood the position's value perfectly. They had spent 2 years fortifying it. The 155mm guns were housed in massive concrete casemates, with walls 6 feet thick, reinforced with steel, and designed to withstand direct hits from naval gunfire. The casemates were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire covering both beaches. Connecting trenches allowed defenders to move under cover between positions. Machine gun nests covered every possible approach from the cliff base. Observation posts provided 360-degree visibility. Minefields surrounded the entire perimeter. The cliff face itself had been fortified with barbed wire strung across likely climbing routes, concrete obstacles embedded in the rock, and prepared positions from which defenders could fire straight down on anyone attempting to climb. The garrison consisted of approximately 200 men from the 352nd Infantry Division's artillery regiment. They weren't elite troops like Fallschirmjäger paratroopers or SS units, but they were experienced, well-equipped, and positioned on ground that heavily favoured defence. They had been drilled endlessly on their defensive assignments. They knew their fields of fire. They had pre-registered artillery coordinates for every approach. German doctrine emphasised the importance of coastal artillery batteries in repelling amphibious invasions. The men assigned to Pointe du Hoc understood their mission completely. Keep those guns operational and keep firing on the invasion fleet no matter what happened. If Allied forces attempted to land at the base of the cliffs, kill them in the water. If they somehow reached the cliff base, kill them during the climb. If any reached the top, kill them in the open before they could assault the gun positions. The defences had been tested and refined. Practice alerts verified that defenders could reach their positions within 2 minutes of an alarm. Communications between the observation posts and gun positions had been rehearsed until they operated flawlessly. Supply caches ensured the position could hold out for days, even if cut off from reinforcement. But Allied intelligence had made a disturbing discovery in the weeks before D-Day. Reconnaissance photographs taken by RAF and USAAF aircraft showed something unexpected. In some photos, the massive concrete casemates appeared empty. The guns themselves seemed to be missing or repositioned. Photo interpreters debated what this meant. Had the Germans moved the artillery inland to protect it from the intensive pre-invasion bombing? Were they planning to move the guns back into position just before the invasion? Were the guns destroyed and the position abandoned? Or was this an elaborate deception to make the Allies think the position was neutralized when in fact it remained fully operational? Allied planners faced an impossible dilemma. If the guns were still at Pointe du Hoc and operational, they absolutely had to be destroyed before the invasion began. But if the guns had been moved or destroyed, then assaulting the position would be sending men to die for an objective that no longer existed. There was no way to know for certain without putting men on top of that cliff. No amount of aerial reconnaissance could provide definitive answers. The casemates were too heavily reinforced to see inside from the air. Only direct observation could confirm whether the guns were present and operational. The mission had to proceed as planned. Rangers would assault Pointe du Hoc at H-hour, climb the cliffs under fire, and determine the situation once they reached the top. If the guns were there, destroy them. If they had been moved, find them and destroy them. And regardless of what they found, hold the position to. Prevent German forces from using the high ground to fire down on Omaha Beach. It was a mission based on incomplete intelligence, requiring extraordinary risks, with success dependent on factors that couldn't be controlled or predicted. In other words, it was exactly the type of mission for which the Rangers had been created. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder was not supposed to be a warrior. He was 34 years old, a former high school teacher and football coach from Brady, Texas. He had been commissioned through the Army Reserve in 1932 and called to active duty in 1941. Rudder was not regular army. He hadn't attended West Point. He lacked the polish and pedigree of academy graduates. His accent was pure Texas. His manner was folksy, and senior officers sometimes dismissed him as just another reserve officer who would need constant supervision. Those officers were wrong. Rudder possessed something that couldn't be taught at any academy: an instinctive understanding of tactics, how to prepare men for the worst combat could offer, and a relentless attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. He understood that courage alone wouldn't get men up that cliff. They needed specific skills, developed through repetition, until they became automatic reflexes that would function even when conscious thought was impossible. In January 1944, Rudder took command of the 2nd Ranger Battalion at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The battalion had been activated in April 1943, modelled on British commando units, designed for special operations requiring small unit tactics, extreme physical conditioning, and the ability to accomplish missions that conventional infantry couldn't attempt. The Rangers were all volunteers. They had enlisted specifically for this type of duty, understanding it would be dangerous, demanding, and almost certainly result in high casualties. They were tough, motivated, and aggressive, but they weren't yet the unit that would be needed for Pointe du Hoc. Rudder had 5 months to turn them into something extraordinary. His training philosophy was brutally simple: make training harder than combat. Subject men to conditions worse than they would face in battle. Break them down physically and mentally. Then build them back up stronger, faster, more resilient. Push them until they discovered capabilities they didn't know they had. The Rangers trained with live ammunition constantly. Not the sanitized training rounds that many units used, but actual combat ammunition fired at realistic distances. Men learned to function while bullets cracked overhead. They learned what incoming fire sounded like, how to judge distance and direction, how to move under fire without panicking. They assaulted fortified positions while instructors threw actual grenades at them. Not training grenades, real fragmentation grenades with full explosive charges. Men who moved too slowly or took inadequate cover were wounded. Several Rangers were killed during training when grenades landed too close or exploded with unexpected fragmentation patterns. Rudder was criticized for the casualties, but he didn't reduce the realism. Better to lose a few men in training than lose entire companies in combat because they didn't understand how to move under fire. They practiced cliff climbing obsessively. Rudder found cliffs that resembled the terrain at Pointe du Hoc and made his Rangers climb them repeatedly. They climbed in daylight and darkness. They climbed in rain, with wet ropes and slippery rocks. They climbed with full combat loads. Rifles, ammunition, grenades, demolition charges, everything they would carry in actual combat. They climbed while instructors fired over their heads and threw smoke grenades to obscure visibility. They climbed while other Rangers at the top of the cliff threw down sandbags and dummy grenades to simulate defensive fire. Men fell. Some were injured seriously enough to be evacuated from training. Others picked themselves up and climbed again. Rudder emphasized problem-solving and initiative. He wanted Rangers who could think under pressure, who could adapt when plans collapsed, who could lead when their officers were killed. Standard Army training produced soldiers who followed orders competently. Rudder needed soldiers who could give orders when the situation demanded it. Every Ranger was cross-trained on multiple weapons. Riflemen learned to operate machine guns. Machine gunners learned to use mortars. Everyone learned basic demolitions. The assumption was that casualties would create gaps in the unit structure, and anyone might need to perform any role on short notice. They practiced small unit tactics endlessly. Squads assaulted fortified positions using fire and maneuver. They learned to suppress enemy positions while other elements flanked. They practiced immediate action drills until responses became automatic. Ambush left, ambush right, contact front, contact rear. Each drill was rehearsed until every man knew exactly what to do without needing orders. Communications training emphasized maintaining contact under the worst conditions. Radio operators learned to send messages while under fire, while moving, while wounded. Backup communication plans were developed and rehearsed. Every man learned basic radio operation so the unit could maintain communications, even if all dedicated radio operators became casualties. Physical conditioning went beyond normal infantry standards. Rangers ran 10 miles before breakfast. They completed obstacle courses in full combat gear. They performed forced marches covering 30 miles in a day. Rudder pushed his men until exhaustion became normal, until they learned to function effectively even when their bodies were screaming for rest. The psychological conditioning was equally important. Rudder taught his Rangers that impossible missions were only impossible until someone accomplished them. He taught them to focus on immediate objectives rather than overall odds. He taught them that determination and aggression could overcome superior numbers and firepower. Most importantly, he built absolute trust between leaders and men. Rudder never asked his Rangers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. During cliff climbing training, Rudder climbed with them. During live fire exercises, Rudder was in the impact area. When Rangers were injured during training, Rudder visited them personally in the hospital. The men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion learned that their commander would never waste their lives, would never order an attack without having thought through every detail, and would never ask them to take risks he wasn't willing to take himself. That trust would prove essential at Pointe du Hoc, when Rangers would need to follow orders that seemed suicidal. By May 1944, the 2nd Ranger Battalion was ready. They had trained for 5 months at an intensity that exceeded any conventional unit. They had suffered casualties during training that would have broken lesser organizations. They had been pushed beyond normal human limits and discovered they could endure. They didn't yet know their target. They didn't know when or where they would be committed to combat, but they knew that when the mission came, it would be extraordinary. And they were ready. The briefing came on May 15th, 1944, at the battalion's staging area in southern England. Rudder assembled his company commanders in a secure room and unrolled a large aerial photograph on the table. The photo showed Pointe du Hoc from directly overhead, the cliff-top position, the gun casemates, the defensive trenches, the sheer cliff face dropping to the narrow beach below. "Gentlemen," Rudder said in his Texas drawl, "this is your objective." The room fell silent as the officers studied the photograph. They saw immediately what they were being asked to do. Some of them had participated in the cliff-climbing training and knew exactly how difficult it would be to scale those cliffs under fire. Others were already calculating casualty rates and extraction routes. Captain Ralph Goranson, commanding officer of C Company, spoke first. "Sir, how many men are we taking up that cliff?" "3 companies," Rudder replied, D, E, and F Company. 225 Rangers total. D Company, under Captain Duke Slater, will lead the assault. E Company, under you, Ralph, will follow immediately behind. F Company, under Captain Otto Masny, will provide fire support and follow on assault as needed. German strength? Approximately 200 defenders from the 352nd Infantry Division. Artillery specialists, not line infantry, but well-trained and dug in. They've had 2 years to prepare these positions. Captain Otto Masny studied the photograph more closely. The gun emplacements? 6 155mm guns in reinforced casemates. Each position has walls 6 feet thick. Naval gunfire will hit them before our assault, but don't count on the guns being destroyed. Plan on having to blow them yourselves using thermite grenades and demolition charges. Timeline? Rudder pointed to the photograph. H hour is 0630. The first wave lands at the cliff base at 0630 precisely. Naval gunfire will cease at 0625 to avoid hitting our men. You'll have 5 minutes of clear approach, then the Germans will start shooting. Plan on taking fire immediately upon landing. Climbing equipment? Rocket-propelled grappling hooks provided by the British. DUKWs will be modified to carry extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade, Bangalore torpedoes to clear wire obstacles at the cliff base. Rope ladders, standard climbing ropes, and toggle ropes for the assault. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, sitting in the back of the room, raised his hand. Rudder nodded at him. "Sir, what's our extraction plan if we can't hold the position?" It was the question everyone was thinking but hadn't wanted to ask. Met Lomell's eyes and gave him an honest answer. "There isn't one, First Sergeant. Once you're up that cliff, the only way off is to hold until relieved or die trying. The follow-up battalions will land on Omaha Beach and move overland to link up with you, but that depends on Omaha going smoothly, which we can't guarantee." The room was silent again. Every officer in that room understood the implications. They were being asked to climb a 100-foot cliff under fire, assault a fortified position with numerical parity at best, accomplish a mission of strategic importance, and then hold that position indefinitely against counterattacks, while hoping that forces landing on Omaha Beach would break through and reach them in time. And if Omaha went badly, if the landings there were repulsed or pinned down on the beach, then the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc would be isolated, outnumbered, surrounded, and ultimately annihilated with no possibility of relief. Captain Goranson asked the question they were all thinking. "Sir, what are our chances?" Rudder didn't hesitate. "If we do everything perfectly, if the naval bombardment is effective, if we get up the cliffs without losing too many men, if we can neutralize the guns quickly and establish a defensive perimeter before German reinforcements arrive, and if the forces on Omaha can break through and reach us within 12 hours, I'd say we have a reasonable chance of success. And if things don't go perfectly, then we'll take heavy casualties, possibly lose the entire assault force, but the mission still has to be accomplished. Those guns threaten thousands of men landing on both beaches. Even if we all die up there, if we can destroy those guns first, it will save lives on Omaha and Utah." No one spoke. The stakes were clear. This was a mission that couldn't be refused regardless of the odds. The strategic necessity outweighed individual survival. Rudder continued the briefing, going into specific details. Assault timing, radio frequencies, recognition signals, defensive positions, fields of fire, fallback positions, ammunition loads, medical support, naval gunfire support procedures. He covered every conceivable contingency and backup plan. But everyone in that room understood that no amount of planning could account for the chaos of combat. Once those landing craft hit the beach and Rangers started climbing those cliffs under fire, the plan would begin falling apart. Men would be killed, equipment would be lost, timing would be disrupted. Success would depend on individual Rangers making correct decisions in impossible circumstances. The mission required three things that couldn't be guaranteed: extraordinary courage, incredible luck, and a level of tactical competence that exceeded normal human capability under combat stress. Rudder believed his Rangers possessed the courage. The luck was beyond anyone's control, and the tactical competence would be tested within 3 weeks. June 6th, 1944, 0630 hours. The landing craft carrying D Company hit the beach at the base of Pointe du Hoc exactly on schedule. Rangers leaped out into waist-deep water and waded toward the narrow strip of rocky beach at the cliff base. German machine gun fire immediately raked the waterline. Men fell. Some were hit before they reached the beach. Others made it to the base of the cliff and took cover behind the few rocks that offered protection. The landing craft reversed away from shore, engines roaring, taking more fire as they withdrew. It was immediately obvious that something had gone wrong. The beach was not where it was supposed to be. The current had pushed the landing craft east of the intended landing point. Instead of being directly below the gun positions, the Rangers were nearly half a mile off target. They would need to move laterally along the base of the cliff under fire before they could even begin climbing. Worse, the naval bombardment had been less effective than hoped. The massive casemates were damaged but not destroyed. Chunks of concrete had been blown off, but the guns were still intact, and the German defenders were fully alert and prepared, not shocked and disoriented as the planners had assumed they would be. Captain Duke Slater, commanding D Company, made an immediate decision. They couldn't move laterally along the beach. The machine gun fire would annihilate them in the open. They had to climb here, now, off target, and then move along the cliff top to reach the guns. It wasn't the plan, but it was the only option that offered any chance of success. "Get those ropes up," Slater shouted over the roar of gunfire and explosions. "Get the grappling hooks fired! Move! Move! Move!" The British-designed rocket-propelled grappling hooks were wheeled forward. These were ingenious devices, rockets mounted on tripods that would fire a grappling hook attached to a rope up to the cliff top. If everything worked correctly, the grappling hooks would catch on the rocks or vegetation at the top, and rangers could climb the ropes to reach the summit. The first rockets fired. The grappling hooks soared upward, trailing ropes behind them, arcing toward the cliff top. Some hooks reached the top and caught, others fell short or bounced off and fell back down. The ropes that did reach the top were immediately targeted by German defenders who tried to cut them or push the grappling hooks loose. The Rangers rushed to the ropes that had successfully caught and began climbing immediately. There was no time to test the ropes, no time to establish covering fire, no time for anything except getting off that beach as quickly as possible because staying on the beach meant certain death. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell grabbed a rope and started climbing. The rope was wet from sea spray, making it slippery. His hands, already cold from the water landing, had trouble gripping. He wrapped the rope around his wrist to prevent slipping, pulled himself upward hand over hand. Above him, he could hear German defenders shouting. He looked up and saw a German soldier leaning over the edge, looking down, raising a grenade to throw. Lomell had one hand on the rope and no way to fire his weapon. He did the only thing he could. He climbed faster. The grenade exploded 20 feet above him. Shrapnel whistled past his head. He felt impacts against his back that might have been rocks or debris. He kept climbing. Another ranger on a rope 10 feet to his left was hit by machine gun fire. The ranger's grip loosened, and he fell, his scream cut short when he hit the rocks below. Lomell didn't look down. Looking down would accomplish nothing except making the climb harder. He focused on the next handhold, the next pull upward, the next foot of altitude gained. Halfway up, Lomell's arms began burning with fatigue. He was carrying 60 pounds of combat gear, rifle, ammunition, grenades, demolition charges, water, medical supplies. Every ranger carried the same load, and every ranger was climbing a 100-foot cliff under fire while carrying combat loads that would have been heavy walking on flat ground. His hands were bleeding now. The wet rope was tearing skin off his palms with every pull. He wrapped the rope around his forearm and used his whole arm to pull himself up, taking weight off his shredded hands. Above him, another grenade exploded. This one was closer. The concussion hammered his ears. He felt shrapnel tear through his pack. If the shrapnel had hit 6 inches lower, it would have severed his spine. He kept climbing. Other rangers were climbing on ropes all along the cliff face. Some were making good progress. Others were struggling, exhausted, hanging on the ropes trying to gather strength for the next pull upward. German defenders were shooting down at them, throwing grenades, pushing rocks off the cliff edge to fall on the climbers below. DUKW's amphibious trucks modified to carry. Extension ladders had reached the beach and were attempting to raise their ladders against the cliff face. One DUKW was hit by German artillery and exploded in a ball of flame. Another managed to get its ladder raised, but the ladder was too short to reach the top. Rangers climbed the ladder anyway because it gave them 40 feet of altitude without having to use ropes, then transferred to climbing ropes for the remaining distance. 75 feet up, Lomell passed a ranger who had been wounded and was hanging onto his rope, unable to climb further, but unwilling to let go. The ranger's face was grey with blood loss. He looked at Lomell and managed to speak. "Keep going, First Sergeant. Don't stop for me." Lomell wanted to help, but there was no way to assist a wounded man on a climbing rope without both of them falling. He reached out and gripped the ranger's shoulder for a moment, then kept climbing. Behind him, he heard the ranger's grip give way and the sound of his body hitting the rocks below. 90 feet up, Lomell could see the cliff-top edge above him. He could also see German defenders moving along the edge, looking for Rangers to shoot. He pulled his Thompson submachine gun around on its sling, held the rope with one hand, and fired a burst one-handed toward the cliff top. The Germans pulled back momentarily. He reached up, grabbed the cliff top edge, and pulled himself up and over. For a moment he lay on the ground, gasping, his arms trembling with exhaustion. Then training took over. He rolled away from the cliff edge, found cover behind a chunk of blasted concrete, and brought his Thompson to his shoulder. Other Rangers were reaching the top. They came up over the edge in ones and twos, exhausted, some wounded, all of them immediately taking cover and returning fire. German defenders were falling back from the cliff edge, retreating toward the gun positions and prepared defensive trenches. Captain Slater reached the top and immediately began organizing the assault. First squad, suppress that machine gun position. Second squad, move left and flank. Third squad, on me. We're going for the guns. The Rangers moved forward in fire and maneuver teams exactly as they had trained. Some men fired, while others moved. They used craters from the naval bombardment as cover, advancing in short rushes, never giving the Germans time to establish effective defensive fire. Lomell moved with a four-man team toward the nearest gun casemate. The casemate loomed ahead, a massive concrete structure that had absorbed multiple direct hits from naval gunfire without being destroyed. The front entrance was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for two men to enter side by side. The team stacked at the entrance. Lomell pulled a fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, counted 2 seconds, and threw the grenade through the entrance. He flattened against the concrete wall outside. The grenade exploded inside with a muffled crump. Before the dust settled, Lomell charged through the entrance with his Thompson firing. The interior was dark, lit only by the muzzle flashes of his weapon. He saw movement and fired. His weapon clicked empty. He dropped the empty magazine, slammed in a fresh one, and kept firing. Behind him, other Rangers poured into the casemate, clearing it room by room. When they reached the gun chamber, they found something that would change everything about the mission. The gun was gone. The massive concrete emplacement that was supposed to hold a 155mm artillery piece was empty. There were mounting bolts where the gun had been positioned, and track marks on the floor showing where it had been wheeled out, but the gun itself was not there. Lomell felt a surge of confusion. Intelligence had been adamant that these guns were the primary target. The entire mission had been designed around destroying these guns, and they weren't here. Check the other casemates, Slater ordered. Rangers assaulted the other gun positions. Each team found the same thing: empty casemates, mounting hardware indicating guns had been present, but no actual artillery pieces. All 6 positions were empty. The Germans had moved the guns. 0745 hours. Lomell and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn volunteered to perform a reconnaissance patrol south of the cliff-top positions. The Rangers had secured the immediate area around the gun casemates, but they had no intelligence about German positions inland. If the guns had been moved, they had to be somewhere nearby. Artillery pieces that large couldn't be moved far without significant logistical effort. Lomell and Kuhn moved carefully through the cratered landscape. The naval bombardment had torn up the ground, creating a moonscape of overlapping shell holes and destroyed vegetation. Visibility was limited to a few dozen yards in any direction due to smoke and dust still hanging in the air. They moved in tactical bounds, one man covering while the other advanced. They communicated with hand signals to avoid making noise. They were 2 Rangers, alone, moving through unknown terrain that certainly contained German forces. If they were spotted, they would be killed or captured before anyone could support them. 200 yards south of the cliff top, they found a sunken farm road. The road showed fresh track marks from heavy vehicles. Lomell knelt beside the tracks and examined them. The tracks were deep and widely spaced, consistent with large wheeled vehicles carrying heavy loads. Artillery, Kuhn whispered. These tracks were made by something heavy moving on wheels. After another 100 yards, the road passed through a hedgerow into an apple orchard. Lomell and Kuhn stopped at the hedgerow and carefully looked through the vegetation. What they saw confirmed their suspicions and changed everything about the mission. In the apple orchard, arranged in a rough line and covered with camouflage netting, were 5 German 155mm artillery pieces. The guns were fully operational, with ammunition stacked nearby and crews working around them. The Germans had indeed moved the guns out of the vulnerable casemates and into a concealed position where they were protected from naval bombardment but could still fire on the invasion beaches. The guns were oriented toward Omaha Beach. At their current position, they could easily reach the beach and would have been devastating to the landing forces. The only reason they weren't already firing was that German communications had been disrupted by the bombardment. The gun crews were waiting for fire missions from forward observers who couldn't reach them through the broken communication network. Lomell counted approximately 100 German soldiers in and around the orchard. Some were artillery crew members, others were infantry providing security. More were arriving. From the south, reinforcements moving toward the sound of fighting at Pointe du Hoc, he and Kuhn were looking at the primary objective of the entire Pointe du Hoc mission. These were the guns that threatened the invasion. These were the guns that had to be destroyed, and they were unguarded, sitting in the open, vulnerable. Lomell made a decision that would be studied in special operations courses for decades afterward. He and Kuhn would destroy the guns themselves, right now, without waiting for support or additional forces. They had thermite grenades designed to destroy artillery by melting the breech mechanisms. They had explosives. They had the element of surprise because the Germans didn't know American forces were this far inland yet. They would never get a better opportunity. "We're doing this," Lomell whispered to Kuhn. "Now, before they move the guns or get them operational." Kuhn nodded. Both Rangers checked their weapons, confirmed they had enough thermite grenades, and prepared to assault the position. They moved through the hedgerow silently, crawling on their bellies through the tall grass at the edge of the orchard. The German soldiers were focused on preparing the guns and watching for threats from the north where they could hear fighting at Pointe du Hoc. They weren't watching their rear. Lomell and Kuhn reached the first gun. It was positioned about 30 yards from the nearest German soldiers. The gun crew was working at the ammunition stacks, their backs to the gun itself. Lomell placed thermite grenades in the gun's breech mechanism and in the traversing gear that allowed the gun to aim. Thermite burns at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It would melt the gun's critical components and render it permanently inoperable. He activated the grenades and moved to the next gun. Kuhn was doing the same on the guns to the left. They moved quickly, efficiently, using the training that had been drilled into them. Within 5 minutes, they had placed thermite grenades on all 5 guns and activated them. The grenades ignited with a brilliant white flash. The Germans immediately started shouting and running toward the guns. Lomell and Kuhn opened fire with their rifles, dropping several Germans before the rest took cover. Then they ran, sprinting back toward the American lines at Pointe du Hoc. German soldiers chased them. Bullets cracked past Lomell's head. He and Kuhn split up to make themselves harder to hit, both of them running in zigzag patterns through the cratered landscape. They reached a large shell crater and dove into it, taking cover. Behind them, the thermite grenades were doing their work. The white-hot chemical fire was melting through steel breech blocks, destroying traversing gears, warping gun barrels. The guns that threatened the entire western flank of the invasion were being rendered useless by 2 Rangers with thermite grenades, while their crews watched helplessly. German infantry was searching the area, trying to find the Americans who had destroyed their guns. Lomell and Kuhn stayed in the crater, weapons ready, preparing for the firefight that would come if they were discovered. After 10 minutes, the German search moved away to the south. The Germans apparently assumed the saboteurs had escaped in that direction. Lomell and Kuhn waited another 5 minutes to be certain, then carefully moved north back toward Pointe du Hoc. They reached American lines at 0815 hours, When they reported what they had done, Captain Slater immediately organized a larger patrol to return to the orchard and confirm the guns were destroyed. The patrol found all 5 guns with their breech mechanisms melted, traversing gears destroyed, barrels warped from the intense heat of the thermite. The guns were completely inoperable and would never fire again. The primary objective of the Pointe du Hoc mission had been accomplished not by the full Ranger assault force, but by 2 men with a handful of thermite grenades. But the mission was far from over. The Rangers still had to hold Pointe du Hoc against German counterattacks, and those counterattacks were about to begin. 0900 hours. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc had accomplished their primary mission, but their situation was becoming desperate. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at 0630 hours, approximately 90 were still combat effective. The rest were dead, wounded, missing, or so exhausted they could barely function. The follow-up Ranger battalions that were supposed to land at Pointe du Hoc, if the initial assault succeeded, had diverted to Omaha Beach when they didn't see the success signal. The situation at Omaha was so chaotic that no one there could spare forces to relieve Pointe du Hoc. The Rangers on the clifftop were on their own. Rudder established a defensive perimeter using the bomb craters and destroyed German fortifications as fighting positions. He positioned machine guns to cover the most likely German approaches. He distributed ammunition, knowing they had limited supplies and no way to get more until relief arrived. Medical personnel established an aid station in one of the concrete casemates. The wounded were brought there for treatment, but medical supplies were limited. Morphine was running low. Bandages were being improvised from torn uniforms. The most seriously wounded would die without evacuation to proper medical facilities, but evacuation was impossible. German forces began probing the American positions. Small groups of infantry would advance toward the Ranger lines, test the defenses, and withdraw when they encountered resistance. These weren't serious attacks, yet they were reconnaissance efforts designed to identify American positions and strengths. Rudder recognized what was happening. The Germans were preparing for a major counterattack. They were gathering forces, identifying targets, and preparing to overwhelm the depleted Ranger, a force with superior numbers. At 1000 hours, the first serious German counterattack began. Approximately 200 German infantry advanced from the south toward the Ranger positions. They moved in proper tactical formation with machine gun teams providing suppressive fire while infantry advanced in rushes. The Rangers opened fire at maximum effective range. M1 Garand rifles and Browning automatic rifles hammered the advancing Germans. Machine gunners fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition while maximizing effect. Every Ranger who could hold a weapon was on the defensive line. The German attack stalled under the accurate American fire. Bodies fell in the open ground between the German start line and the American positions. German machine gunners tried to suppress the Ranger positions but couldn't achieve fire superiority because they were shooting uphill at dug-in defenders. After 20 minutes of fierce firefighting, the Germans withdrew, leaving dozens of dead and wounded in the open. They had tested the American defenses and found them stronger than expected. The next attack would be heavier, 1,200 hours. A second German attack, this time from the east. The Germans had learned from the first assault. They used smoke grenades to obscure Ranger fields of fire. They advanced more slowly, using available cover. They concentrated mortar fire on known Ranger positions. The Rangers adjusted. When smoke obscured visibility, they fired into the smoke at waist height, knowing advancing infantry would be moving through. They called out target locations to each other, compensating for limited visibility. They shifted positions between German attacks, refusing to remain static and predictable. This attack penetrated closer to the Ranger lines before being repulsed. Hand-to-hand combat erupted when German infantry reached the Ranger fighting positions. Men fought with rifle butts, entrenching tools, knives, fists, whatever was available. The fighting was savage, desperate, personal. The Germans again withdrew after suffering heavy casualties. But the Rangers had also taken losses. More men were wounded, Ammunition was running dangerously low. Some positions were down to their last few magazines. Rudder made a difficult decision. He pulled back the defensive perimeter, contracting it to a smaller area that fewer men could defend effectively. He abandoned the outer positions and consolidated around the gun casemates, using the thick concrete walls as protection. The abandoned positions were immediately occupied by German forces who used them to fire on the contracted American perimeter. The Rangers were now completely surrounded, defending a shrinking area against an enemy that grew stronger with each hour. 1,400 hours. The Germans attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. This was a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the American defenses by forcing them to split their fire and respond to multiple threats at once. The Rangers fought desperately. Some positions ran out of ammunition and resorted to throwing grenades, then rocks, then fighting hand to hand. Men, too wounded to stand, propped themselves against walls and fired until their weapons clicked empty. First Sergeant Lomell was everywhere along the defensive line, moving from position to position, distributing ammunition from the dead and wounded, encouraging exhausted men, directing fire. He exposed himself constantly to German fire, but somehow remained unwounded. The German attack penetrated the perimeter at one point. German infantry entered the American positions, and brutal close-quarters combat erupted. Rangers fought room to room through the damaged casemates, clearing Germans in vicious fights where visibility was measured in feet and men killed each other at arm's length. The breach was sealed after 15 minutes of desperate fighting, but it demonstrated how tenuous the American hold had become. The Germans were getting stronger, the Rangers were getting weaker. Eventually, the mathematics would become insurmountable. 1,600 hours. Rudder gathered his remaining officers and senior NCOs. They huddled in a blast crater while German mortar fire landed around them. "Ammunition status?" Rudder asked. The reports were grim. Most riflemen had less than 1 magazine remaining. Machine gunners had enough ammunition for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained fire. Grenades were almost exhausted. Mortar ammunition was gone. Medical supplies. Morphine depleted. Bandages mostly used. We're tearing up uniforms for bandages. Plasma is gone. The seriously wounded are going to die without evacuation. Water. Canteens mostly empty. No resupply possible. Rudder looked at his officers. These were good men, professional soldiers, and they all knew what the situation meant. They could not hold much longer against determined attacks. They would run out of ammunition. Then the Germans would overrun the position, and every Ranger would be killed or captured. "How long can we hold?" Rudder asked. Captain Slater answered, "Maybe 2 more attacks. 3 if we're lucky and the Germans don't realize how weak we are. But sir, once we run out of ammunition, it's over." Rudder nodded. He had one option left: call for naval gunfire support. American destroyers offshore could fire on German positions around Pointe du Hoc, potentially breaking up their attacks and buying time for relief forces to arrive. But naval gunfire so close to American positions was extraordinarily dangerous. The destroyers would be firing inland from offshore positions, unable to see their targets directly, relying on radio communications from spotters to adjust fire. Any mistake, any miscommunication, any error in coordinates, and American shells would land on American positions, killing the men they were supposed to protect. Rudder made the call. He had no choice. Without fire support, they would be overrun. With fire support, they might survive until relief arrived. It was a terrible risk, but it was the only option. At 1,630 hours, USS Satterlee, a destroyer offshore, received the fire mission. The ship's 5-inch guns elevated and fired. Shells screamed overhead and exploded 800 yards south of Pointe du Hoc, hitting German assembly areas where troops were gathering for another attack. Ranger spotters on the clifftop adjusted fire, walking the shells back and forth across suspected German positions. The effect was devastating. German formations were shattered by the accurate naval gunfire. Attack preparations were disrupted, casualties mounted. But the Germans adapted. They moved closer to the American positions, understanding that the naval gunfire couldn't be used if they were intermixed with American forces. At 1,700 hours, another German attack came, this time with infantry advancing to within hand grenade range before the main assault. The fighting became hand-to-hand again. Germans and Americans grappled in shell craters, fighting with knives, fists, rocks, anything available. Wounded men on both sides fought from the ground, shooting at legs, pulling down standing fighters. The attack was repulsed, but barely. The Rangers had fired their last rifle ammunition and were now relying on captured German weapons and ammunition stripped from German dead. They had become so desperate that wounded Rangers, too injured to walk, were given rifles and positioned as immobile defenders who could at least shoot from their positions. 1,800 hours. Dusk was falling. Darkness would bring relief from German observation and direct fire, but it would also allow German infiltration into American positions. The Rangers were too weak to maintain continuous perimeter security in darkness. Rudder knew they couldn't survive another night without reinforcement. He sent another message to the forces on Omaha Beach, requesting immediate relief, describing the desperate situation, explaining that Pointe du Hoc would be lost without support within the next few hours. The response came back quickly. Forces were moving toward Pointe du Hoc, but they couldn't arrive before morning. The situation at Omaha Beach had been so chaotic that breaking through German defences and moving inland had taken all day. Relief was coming, but it was still hours away. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc would have to hold through the night. Number. The longest night darkness brought a different kind of terror. The Germans didn't launch massive attacks in the darkness, they didn't need to. Instead, they infiltrated small teams into the American positions, probing for weak points, eliminating isolated defenders, creating chaos and confusion. Rangers heard movement in the darkness but couldn't shoot without revealing their positions and wasting precious ammunition. German soldiers threw grenades into American positions, then withdrew before the Rangers could respond. Wounded men screamed in the darkness, and Rangers couldn't risk moving to help them because German infiltrators were waiting to ambush anyone who moved. Rudder organized the defense into small groups, each responsible for a sector of the perimeter. Men were paired up so no one was alone in the darkness. They whispered challenges and passwords to identify each other in the darkness. Anyone who didn't respond correctly was shot immediately. The password system broke down when German soldiers captured wounded Rangers and forced them to reveal the passwords. Germans then used the correct passwords to infiltrate American positions, leading to firefights between Rangers who couldn't be certain who was American and who was German in the darkness. Some Rangers resorted to only trusting men they personally recognized by voice. Others established individual signals with their partners, specific phrases or questions that only they would know. The paranoia was essential for survival but exhausting. First Sergeant Lomell moved through the positions constantly, checking on his men, ensuring they stayed alert, redistributing the last remaining ammunition. He whispered encouragement to exhausted Rangers who were barely conscious. "Just hold until dawn." Lomell repeated over and over. "Relief is coming. Just hold until dawn." Some Rangers believed him. Others were too exhausted to care. They sat in their fighting positions, weapons across their laps, fighting to stay awake while their bodies demanded sleep. At 0200 hours, a major German attack came from the south. The Germans had infiltrated within 50 yards of the American positions under cover of darkness, then launched a mass charge at close range. The Rangers responded with everything they had left. Rifles fired point-blank into the charging Germans. The few remaining machine guns fired until their barrels glowed red and ammunition ran out. Rangers threw their last grenades. When the Germans reached the positions, hand-to-hand combat erupted again. Men fought in total darkness, unable to see their enemies, fighting by sound and touch. Rifle butts smashed into skulls. Knives found targets by feel. Men grappled on the ground, strangling each other, biting, clawing. The attack was repulsed, but the cost was staggering. More Rangers were wounded. Ammunition was completely exhausted in some positions. Men sat in their fighting holes with empty rifles, armed only with knives or rocks, waiting for the next German attack that would inevitably overwhelm them. Captain Slater was killed during this attack, shot through the head while organizing a counterattack. Captain Goranson took command of the survivors, now numbering fewer than 60 men capable of fighting. 0400 hours. Another German probe from the east. This attack was beaten back only because the Germans stumbled into a minefield. The Rangers had improvised using captured German mines repositioned during the previous evening. The mines exploded among the German infantry, killing several and disrupting the attack. But even that small victory came with a cost. The explosion revealed the exact positions of Ranger fighting holes to any observant German commander. The next attack would target those specific locations. Rudder gathered Goranson, Lomell, and the few remaining officers. They crouched in what had become the command post, a large bomb crater with some overhead cover from fallen concrete. "Status?" Rudder asked quietly. Goranson answered, "Sir, we have approximately 55 men still capable of fighting. Most of those are wounded to some degree. We have almost no rifle ammunition left. Machine guns are out. We have maybe 24 grenades total. Medical supplies are exhausted. We have 47 men too seriously wounded to fight who need immediate evacuation. And the Germans know exactly where we are and how weak we are. How long can we hold? Maybe one more attack if it's not too heavy. If the Germans commit 200 men to a coordinated assault, they'll overwhelm us. We don't have the ammunition to stop them." Rudder looked at his watch. 0430 hours. Dawn would come around 0600. If relief forces reached them by mid-morning, they had to hold for another 5 hours. 5 hours with no ammunition, exhausted men, overwhelming German forces surrounding them on all sides. "We hold," Rudder said simply. "That's the mission. We hold until relieved or until we're all dead. Pass that to the men." The message went out to every fighting position. Hold. No retreat, no surrender, no withdrawal. Hold this ground no matter what happens. The men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion understood. They had known from the beginning this was a one-way mission. They had climbed that cliff understanding they might not come down. Now they would prove what they were made of. 0545 hours. The sky began to lighten in the east. Rangers in their fighting positions strained to see through the pre-dawn gloom, expecting another German attack at any moment. What they saw instead was movement to the north. At first, they thought it was another German attack from that direction. Then someone recognized the uniforms. "Americans! We got Americans coming from Omaha." Elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment and the 5th Ranger Battalion had finally broken through from Omaha Beach and were advancing toward Pointe du Hoc. They had fought through German defensive lines all the previous day and through the night. They had taken heavy casualties themselves, but they had kept pushing because they knew the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc were counting on them. The relief force reached the Ranger perimeter at 0615 hours. Fresh troops moved into positions, bringing ammunition, food, water, medical supplies. Medics immediately began treating the wounded. The seriously injured were evacuated on stretchers back toward Omaha Beach for transport to hospital ships. The Germans, seeing American reinforcements arriving, broke off their attacks and withdrew to the south. They had missed their opportunity to overrun Pointe du Hoc by less than an hour. Rudder met with the commander of the relief force, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, and provided a situation report. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at 0630 on D-Day, only 90 remained. Of those 90, fewer than 50 were unwounded. The battalion had taken 70% casualties in 36 hours of continuous combat, but they had accomplished their mission. The guns at Pointe du Hoc had been destroyed and would never fire on the invasion beaches. The high ground had been held, preventing Germans from using it to observe and direct fire onto Omaha Beach, and the Germans had been forced to commit significant forces to counter-attacking Pointe du Hoc, forces that couldn't be used to repel the main invasion. The Rangers had succeeded at a cost that would have broken most units. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell survived Pointe du Hoc and the subsequent fighting in France and Germany. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for destroying the guns in the apple orchard. After the war, he returned to New Jersey, became a lawyer, and rarely spoke about his experiences. He died in 2011 at age 91. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder survived the war despite being wounded multiple times. He returned to Texas, became president of Texas A&M University, and later served as Land Commissioner of Texas. He never forgot the Rangers he had commanded and worked to ensure their sacrifices were remembered. He died in 1970 at age 59. Captain Ralph Goranson survived Pointe du Hoc and continued fighting through the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and multiple Silver Stars. After the war, he remained in the army, retired as a colonel, and spent decades ensuring the story of Pointe du Hoc was accurately told. He died in 2004 at age 89. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was rebuilt after D-Day and continued fighting through France and Germany. They participated in the Battle of Hürtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the battalion had taken over 400% casualties, meaning the average Ranger position had been filled by 4 different men due to casualties. The gun battery at Pointe du Hoc was never rebuilt. The position remained abandoned for the rest of the war. Today, it is preserved as the Pointe du Hoc Ranger Monument, maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission. Visitors can walk the cratered landscape, see the damaged casemates, and stand at the cliff edge where Rangers climbed under fire. The story of Pointe du Hoc reveals fundamental truths about impossible missions. Success required extraordinary preparation, tactical innovation, and individual courage that exceeded normal human capability. Rudder's 6 months of brutal training transformed volunteers into specialists, capable of accomplishing missions that conventional forces couldn't attempt. But training alone wasn't sufficient. Success also required junior leaders like Lomell, who could make correct decisions independently when plans collapsed and communications failed. The guns were destroyed not because of the overall plan, but because 2 Rangers took initiative when they discovered an unexpected opportunity. Most importantly, success required men who refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitable. The Rangers on Pointe du Hoc were outnumbered, surrounded, out of ammunition, and exhausted beyond human limits. Every rational calculation said they should surrender or withdraw. They held anyway because their commander had asked them to, and they trusted him enough to believe it mattered. The strategic impact extended far beyond the immediate objective. Every subsequent special operations mission in American military history built on lessons learned at Pointe du Hoc, the importance of specialized training, the value of junior leader initiative, the necessity of combined arms coordination, and the reality that some missions will cost more than anyone wants to pay, but must still be accomplished. The Rangers who climbed that cliff on D-Day understood they were being asked to do the impossible. They did it anyway. They did it because the mission mattered more than individual survival. They did it because they trusted their leaders. They did it because they had trained for 6 months to develop capabilities that made impossible missions possible. And when the mission was complete, when relief finally arrived, when they could finally rest, they didn't celebrate. They mourned the friends who had died beside them. They helped evacuate the wounded. They cleaned their weapons and prepared for the next mission, because that's what Rangers do. 70 years after the battle, President Ronald Reagan stood at Pointe du Hoc and addressed the surviving Rangers. His words captured what they had accomplished. These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war. But the Rangers themselves never claimed to be heroes. They claimed only to have done their duty, to have accomplished the mission they had been given, and to have honoured the memory of those who died doing it. The lesson of Pointe du Hoc is not that impossible missions can be accomplished easily. The lesson is that impossible missions can be accomplished at all if men are properly trained, properly led, and willing to pay the price. The price at Pointe du Hoc was 70% casualties. 135 Rangers killed, wounded, or captured out of 225 who landed. That price was paid willingly by men who understood that some ground must be taken and held regardless of cost. The guns were destroyed. The high ground was held. The invasion succeeded. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc did exactly what they had been asked to do, and in doing so, they wrote a chapter of military history that will be studied as long as armies need to accomplish impossible missions. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans continents and generations, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.